Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 38, Emergence. What is emergence? So in science or in physics especially, but also in science generally, you speak of emergence. What you mean by this is that there are processes or properties of a system that come about that when you look at a system in the beginning, at the original, at the building blocks of the system, at the individual points, you will not predict that such thing could happen. You cannot see from there that these properties or these processes will occur. And one example for this is an example from mathematics. It's Simon Conway's Game of Life. So Simon Conway was a mathematician, and he's especially known for developing this Game of Life, which is basically a game on a cellular automaton. So you need to just imagine just a grid. And this grid is basically every square in this grid is a cell. And this cell can be either alive or it can be dead. And there are certain rules that define if a cell will come alive, stay alive, or if it will die or if it will stay dead. So basically, a cell will stay alive if it has 2 or 3 living neighbors. So if around the cell there are 2 or 3 neighbors who are alive, then this cell will also stay alive. If there is a dead cell which has 3 neighbors, then it will come alive. This you can consider as just as something like birth. So these 3 cells or the cells around it reproduce and a new cell is born. So this is a birth of a new cell. If you just use these 2 rules, then you can conclude from that. Then therefore a cell will die if it has less than 2 neighbors. This you can consider as being death by isolation, for example. Or it will die if it has more than 3 neighbors. So this can be considered as death by overpopulation, for example. And with these simple rules, you can build constructs. So you can just set this grid, use this grid and set some cells alive and let it play out through the generations. And with these simple rules, you can really get really complex structures and complex behavior that you cannot really predict from the outset. So you can, for example, have these kind of gliders that are gliding over the grid through the generations. You can have these, if you, for example, have a 4-block square, then this will just stay as it is because these cells will keep each other alive, but will not produce other cells around it. And so they will be just staying at one place. And then there are structures who will just annihilate or who will just die out. And so there are many, many different structures. You can have many things going on. So if you're interested in this, then just check on YouTube for videos of that, of crazy things that are happening in such Game of Life scenarios. And you can really, from the outset, from the initial conditions that you give there, you usually cannot see what will happen in the future, what complex kind of structures will emerge. And this is one example of emergence where really simple rules, really simple laws, so to speak, will lead to really complex structures that you would not predict from it. So why is this the case? How does this occur? And one reason for this is the irreducibility, which is basically that if you reduce it at one element of this system that you have, that you cannot conclude anything from it. For example, if you have Simon Conway's Game of Life and you just look at what one cell is doing without taking into account the cells around it and so on, then you will not see anything because the behavior of the cell depends on what happens around this cell. So you cannot just reduce the system to one point, to one building block, because it depends on the other building blocks. Another example of that is, for example, if you look at the societal behavior of wolves. there you have the similar case. If you just take one wolf in isolation and see how he behaves, this will be completely different from his societal behavior with other wolves, because his societal behavior with other wolves depends on him being with other wolves. So him in isolation will not tell you anything about it, obviously. So this is also another example for that. Another reason why emergence occurs is because of the unpredictability. So as in the game of life, it's such a complex system that with any generation there are new relationships, new cells occurring at different places, which affects different cells there, and so on and so on. So it's really complex, and therefore it is impossible to predict what will happen. And from so this is basically what emergence is. So in this way you can understand how emergence works. What is done now is usually that one concludes from this, okay, we have this structure of emergence, so there are many things we do not really understand, and when we reduce it to its building blocks, we do not understand how the emerging results that we see can come from there, and therefore we will just assume that it is in some way emergence that leads to that. One example of that is, for example, consciousness. Today, many people assume that the consciousness arises from or emerges from our neuronal systems in our brains, that it just by some effect, all those neurons who are working together in some way through all this emerges the thing that we call consciousness. And this sounds pretty reasonable, and in some sense it's true that out of this something emerges, but it is not a complete description of what really happens, or it cannot be considered as an explanation of what really happens, or if there is not something more happening, because also it is the case that usually in emergent cases where new effects emerge, that they are not completely new. So that they are not fundamentally new. They are not fundamentally different. And in the case of consciousness, it would be something fundamentally different from how a brain works, or how also a computer works. So if you just consider the brain as something like a computer, and out of this some consciousness emerges because of its complexity, this is an easy way out, because the consciousness is as I would argue, a fundamental difference from just the way a computer would work, and therefore this would not be a good explanation for how consciousness can come from just a brain working, or like neurons who are connected to each other. So in some sense you can see here that sometimes emergence in today's age is used as a scientific sounding but actually bad explanation for things we do not understand yet. So in some sense you might even argue that it is kind of an atheistic God of the gaps argument. So we had it several times on this podcast. The argument of God of the gaps is basically that every time, or is a critique brought to Christians or creationists, who every time when they don't understand, when something in science is not understood, they say, yeah, that's because of God. God did it this way, and God is behind it, and so on, which is a critique which is clearly a valid critique, which I also discuss in an article on sci-faith.substack.com, which you can read there. But in some sense, this emergence as an explanation of something like consciousness is really similar to that it is a God of the gap argument just from an atheistic worldview. Time for a short break. And as always in these breaks, I just read some portion of my new book or my new novel, Alien Thoughts, where it is just about thought control, mind control, and so on. So let me just read some extract of it. Since she was still agitated after the day's experiences, she decided to calm herself down with some entertainment. She started the entertainment program on her neurochip and closed her eyes. She selected a stand-up comedy program. The neurochip projected a live stand-up program onto her inner eye by tapping into her imagination. The program featured her favorite comedian Frank Thomas. He was one of the few privileged people who were allowed to perform their comedy live. To get this permission, each joke had to meet the requirements of the government. Since the AI's examination of the jokes could take several seconds depending on the type of joke, only those comedians could be considered for which this time was sufficiently short. This ensured that no unauthorized jokes made it into the live program. However, it was not only a matter of ensuring that no unauthorized jokes were made, but rather to use humor specifically to promote the ideals and goals of the government. Boris had understood early on the importance of humor and entertainment for mind control. Humor could be used to skillfully make people's worldview appear absurd, make them turn away from it, and make them accept the worldview that was presented. Comedians who understood to use this as the goal of their comedy quickly became successful. Even when they made fun of things in the government, they did so with the undertone that is nevertheless good and right. Studies showed that without the use of humor, it would have taken much longer to make the neurochip requirement and the control by alien thoughts socially acceptable. Frank Thomas was a master at using humor to promote the ideals of the government without letting the laughter fall by the wayside. For example, he just told about how he discussed with the neurochip whether it was okay to eat another candy bar after the hamburger. He reenacted the discussion in a sketch-like manner. Patricia couldn't stop laughing and gradually fell asleep while she was still watching. So in this short excerpt, it's about this comedian Frank Thomas, who will also play a crucial role in the later part of the story. So if you found this interesting and want to find more about this, then I really encourage you to get the book. You can get it at Amazon. Alien Thoughts, it's called. Just type it in and maybe also my name, then you will clearly find it. And if you have read it and you liked it, then I really would be glad if you could leave a review. This just helps other people to understand what a book is about and see if this is also something that they might like to read. Emergence is still really fascinating because many properties of nature who are really necessary for life are really emergent. So for example, as I also wrote on my blog sci-faith.substack.com, which I mentioned several times, I had also a blog post about the fine-tuning of the universe, and in this I really I tell also about this property of carbon, that it has this property that there is some spectral line of carbon that is exactly at the place where it needs to be for life to be able to exist. So it's exactly at this energy that this line is there, and this is really needed that life can exist. And how does this came about? So in the equations you see this nowhere because you have it like this. So this is this is atomic physics, what you are talking about there. So you have the physics of atom that you are trying to describe. And actually there it's the case that only the hydrogen atom can be solved analytically. So you can use the quantum mechanical equation, so the Schrödinger equation, for example. You can use this one to analytically solve the hydrogen equation, which is already pretty difficult business, but you can do it. But if you go to the next higher atom, which would be helium, you cannot solve that analytically anymore, and you need to do approximations. And doing these approximations, you always lose something. So you always lose some kind of the understanding how these results come about. And especially for carbon, you need to do a lot more approximations, because it's an atom that is even more complex than helium. And therefore you kind of lose even more information. And then this line, this spectral line that you see there, comes just about really randomly. So you don't see from the original equation, from the Schrödinger equation, why this line should be there or has to be there. It's just randomly, but kind of randomly, that it is there. And on the other hand, it has to be there for life to exist. So it's really a question of life and death that this line is there, because otherwise carbon-based life forms could not exist. This is the thinking behind this. So, and this just emerges out of the physical equations without you seeing it. So emergence is not just some interesting effect. It's something that in nature is really important, and that leads to properties that are really needed for life to exist in nature. And to me, that shows that there has to be some ingenious designer behind this world who really perfectly tuned this world such that the effects and the properties that are needed for life to exist on this planet, on this world, that they are perfectly tuned, that they not only are there to see in the original equations, in the basic laws of nature, but that they beautifully emerge out of these laws of nature without us even noticing it, without us even seeing how this really comes about. And this is, I think, a really sign for me. It's really a sign that there is a designer behind this world who built this nature really beautifully, and who made it such that these effects just beautifully emerge with effortlessly, without being seen in any kind of fundamental laws which still are responsible for it occurring. So this is, I think, a real wonderful sign on the world, that the world has in fact been created. And also, I think, if you see that emergence, as I have stated, is also something that occurs in societal behavior, that when for example, wolves, how they interact, this is also emerging behavior. And also, of course, among humans, there's something emerging in our relationships with each other, in our behavior towards each other. And I think the same is true in our relationship with God. So if we enter in a relationship with God, you might sometimes think, what do I have from it? What is the sense in having relationships, and so on, because from the baseline you might not see any prospect in it, but I think everyone who engaged in good relationships might have realized there are some effects that you might not even have thought of that come about if you just engage in those relationships. And more than in human relationships, this is the case for our relationship with God. So the more we invest in our relationship with God, the more we engage in it, the more we yield to Him, the more He can manifest Himself in our lives, and the more these things can emerge in our lives, in our relationship with Him, that just things are emerging that we did not even thought about. So I experienced this many times in my relationship with God, that the more I pressed into it, the more things began to emerge, or the things began to leave me that were not good for me, and that I got rid of without even thinking about it, or that the effects were occurring where I did not even was trying to get to, but that they were just coming out of this relationship. And I think this is what also the Lord is calling us into, and therefore it's also important that even though we do not always understand what He is doing, we do not always understand how He interacts with it, or even though it will not always make sense to us, He's really working on us, He's acting on us. And just like these cases of emergence where things come out of fundamental laws, that we do understand, but where the effects we do not necessarily always understand. There it is the case that we might understand how our relationship with the Lord works, but the things that emerge from that we might not always understand, and the effects it has we might not always foresee, but they will always be good as His word promises us. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that. And now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.